Good evening and welcome. My name is Jean Morrison, and I am the co-president with Mary Utt of the League of Women Voters of the Cape Cod area. Thank you for joining us this evening for this first event in a Florence Seldin Democracy is Not a Spectator Sport speaker series. Youth Power, Claiming Our Future with Our Vote. Florence Seldin was a treasured and beloved member of the League of Women Voters for more than 50 years. And her life personified the statement that democracy is not a spectator sport. We can think of no better way than to begin this series to think about our most fundamental form of participation in our democracy, and that's our vote. We've asked you to join us today as a community of young adults, educators, civic organizers, election officials, and members of the local news media to help us look at voting in two ways. Today, we have a near-term goal and a long-term continuing goal. First, in the upcoming midterm election, we want young adults to understand the importance of voting. And this and all other elections, and to be aware of the resources that will help them to be prepared to vote. Second, our long-term continuing goal is to create a culture and infrastructure across our community that nurtures young adults to become lifelong voters. To help us understand what it takes to achieve this goal, we have asked Belle Booth, election coordinator from CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement at Tufts University, to share highlights from their recent report, Growing Voters. We will follow Ruby's presentation with 4 young adults we have asked to provide their perspectives on the importance of voting and what more can be done to support young people in voting. To prepare young adults for voting, League member Rosemary Shields will share helpful resource information and links. And League member Karen Maza will be the facilitator for our program, and she will introduce each of the speakers. Audience members will be able to ask questions in our chat function, and these questions will be addressed and will be saved and addressed at the end of the program. Thank you again for your participation, and I hope you find the presentation meaningful and enjoyable. I'm turning the program over to you now, Karen Maza, the Chair of Youth Services. Thanks.
Belle Booth is the election coordinator at CIRCLE, the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, and one of the authors of the CIRCLE Growing Voters report. Ruby is interested in youth civic participation as a pathway for social, racial, and economic justice, and she is passionate about increasing youth voice throughout our political and education systems and in CIRCLE's research. She is also a fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice, researching civic learning and engagement. Welcome, Ruby.
Thanks, Karen. And thank you all for being here and for having me here. I'm really excited to talk to you tonight. I'm not sure, Richard, would you like me to share my slides? Well, I will start by giving a bit more information about CIRCLE. As Karen said, it's the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement. I'm the elections coordinator there. We are based at the Jonathan M. Tisch College for Civic Life at Tufts University. And you can go to the next slide, please. Thank you. And we are focused on researching how young people are engaged in democracy. We pay special attention to marginalized youth and to some of the barriers that exist for participating in democracy. And we also try to find solutions and pathways for more equitable participation in democracy. You can go to the next slide, please. I want to start by talking about why the youth vote matters. And I think the answer to this question is really important for everyone who's on the call today, both the young people to understand their own power, and for adults who can support young people's engagement, as I'm going to talk a lot more about later. On the next slide, you'll see that I want to start by talking about young people's participation and why it matters at a few different levels. So first, it really matters for our democracy. Our communities and our democracy become more just and equitable when all people get involved and take action. Every issue our government and elections impact are felt by youth, and some issues are uniquely or differently felt by young people, like gun violence, education, the environment, housing, a host of other economic and social justice issues. When young people vote and participate in our political system, they're offering their perspective on these issues that are really important to their lives. Their participation is essential for our democracy to live up to its potential. Sorry, I didn't mean to rhyme there. Young people's participation is also really important for communities. Just as young people experience the community's problems firsthand, they also often lead efforts to help address these problems through activism, mutual aid, and more. Communities are stronger and more resilient when young people participate, which our research shows, having found that higher levels of civic engagement can help communities overcome economic downturns and lead to lower unemployment rates. Participation is also really beneficial for youth themselves. Not only can young people affect change on the issues that matter to them, but voting and other forms of civic engagement can in and of themselves better young people's lives. Youth engagement can lead to increased academic performance, improved social emotional well-being, can build skills and networks that are valued in the workplace, and can thus be a source of economic mobility. When youth feel empowered to take action and when they start to see that their efforts are creating real change in their communities, it can have a really profound and lasting impact, and our research has shown that over and over again. And lastly, young people's participation can do a lot for equity. One source of inequality in America is underrepresentation in civic and political life as a result of marginalization or oppression. Too often, when some voices in our communities go unheard, their problems go unaddressed. And then these gaps become more entrenched across generations. So supporting young people's political power can be an intervention in this cycle that can promote a more just and equitable society. So clearly, when young people vote and participate in our democracy, it's good for everybody. Next slide. In practice, the youth vote matters because it can have massive impacts on electoral outcomes at the local level and even at the national level. My next two slides will look at data from the national level because that's what much of Circle's data can best speak to, but I want to be really clear that young people can also have a big impact at the local level as well. In fact, it can be even easier for young people to engage deeply with local elections by volunteering for campaigns, speaking to candidates, or even running for office themselves. This slide shows the presidential election results from 2020 on the left and what the results would have looked like if only young people ages 18 to 29 had voted on the right. I'm going to talk more about the partisanship of it all in a moment, but I wanted to put this image here because I think it shows really profoundly how impactful young voters' votes can be if they turn out, and that is because they often vote differently from the electorate as a whole. The chart on the next slide shows that young people's net votes for President Biden in 2020 exceeded the margins of victory in a few key states, which is a way that we as researchers quantify the impact of young people's votes. For instance, young voters may have swung the race in Arizona, where Biden received over 120,000 more votes from youth than Trump, but only won by 21,000 votes. So if more young people had turned out, or if fewer young people had turned out, or if more young conservatives had turned out, or if fewer young liberals had turned out, it really could have turned the tide of the election because there was such a narrow margin of victory and there were so many young people engaged. Today's young people, 18 to 29-year-olds, are the most diverse generation. Of course, this is in part because of identities like racial and ethnic identities, gender and sexuality, but young people also have a really wide diversity of beliefs. I know the map I showed shows the reality that broadly speaking, young people are more liberal than the general population, but there are also millions of conservative youth who are also engaged or waiting to be engaged by campaigns and organizations. Even as a minority, their votes can have power. I mean, there's a reason that not every state on that map is blue. So even if often when we talk about the power of the youth vote, it manifests as democratic victories, young people are not a monolith, and part of uplifting the power of the youth vote is to honor the power of its diversity. And that's something that especially, I know Circle is a non-partisan organization, and I know the League is as well. So we really want to highlight that young people of all ideological backgrounds all deserve to have their voice in this democracy, and they will all have an impact by turning out to vote. And before I transition to the next topic, I also want to briefly acknowledge that as a young person, I understand that voting is just a piece of the puzzle for a lot of young people's engagement, and it's often not even the most important piece. Both myself and Circle believe wholeheartedly that voting is an important way to supplement other forms of engagement like protesting or volunteering or lobbying or being engaged in your community in a different way. This action that happens pretty infrequently, voting, is a way to punctuate the engagement that happens the rest of the year by ensuring accountability and serving as another avenue for young people to assert their voices. So while voting is hugely important, it is far from the only way that young people are making an impact on our democracy and our country. Now, on the next slide, I want to start to transition to talking about how we can better support young voters. As was mentioned earlier this year, Circle put out a report called Growing Voters, which outlines some of the fundamental problems with our current approaches to youth engagement and what Circle sees as a solution. And for the remainder of my presentation, I'm going to present some of the findings from that report to you. At Circle, we believe we need to change our thinking about youth voting and our approach to young people's participation in democracy. Next slide, please. A lot of people say that there is a problem with young people in our democracy. And if you ask people what the problem is, many will tell you, well, young people don't vote. Yes, young people vote less than older people, but it's way more complicated than that. One of my colleagues put it really beautifully by saying whether a young person shows up at the ballot box is not the start of the story, it's the end of it. It's an outcome dependent on whether we've supported them to do it, encouraged them, and made them feel welcomed and included in our democratic process. For many youth, we haven't done that. And that's the real problem, and this idea of growing voters is meant to be a solution to that. On the next slide, you will see this graph, which shows turnout in elections by race and ethnicity. We can see that for most of the last 50 years, young people of color have been supported less than white youth in voting and turning out and expressing their voice in our democracy. On the next slide is another inequality, this time by education. There are vast differences in voter turnout based on college and high school experience and completion. Even in a year like 2020, with a major increase in youth voter turnout overall, we see that a rising tide did not lift all boats. This shows that we're looking at profound layers of inequality that don't start at the polling place, they end there. A lot of people will point to these graphs or to young people's turnout and say that it is because of apathy or lack of interest, but the research actually doesn't support this. Next slide, please. We find that these varying levels of participation in elections, whether it's between youth and older folks or among youth, is much more about access than it is about apathy. You'll see here what I mean. The darker green and darker blue bars show youth who were interested in some kind of political engagement, but did not have the opportunity to participate. We are failing to meet the interests that young people have. Our report digs into a lot of examples of the lack of opportunities that young people have to learn about and get engaged in elections. Some young people learn about elections in schools, others not at all. Some talk about elections at home, others not at all. Some have TikTok feeds fully saturated with political content. Others could scroll for hours or days and never come across a single political video. There are massive inequities that exist in where and how young people are hearing about, learning about, and participating in elections and democracy. And that's a problem for our democracy, our communities, and young people. But I've been talking about our big structural problems, and we can't fill these gaps with individual disconnected efforts. Next slide, please. So at Circle, we're calling for a really big shift to engage young people around elections, from mobilizing young voters to growing voters. And this idea of growing voters is what the report is all about. Next slide. Right now, the approach to youth voter engagement is one of mobilization. This means that in the months before an election, in states or locales with competitive elections, people are engaging in efforts to register and turn out young voters. They tend to focus on young people who are registered to vote, perceived as easy to reach, and maybe who already have voted before. This approach leaves out a ton of young people. It honestly leaves out most of them. It's transactional, and that is failing our democracy. So Circle is calling for a shift to growing voters. This means beginning to build knowledge, efficacy, and culture around election participation even before young people reach 18, the voting age, in every single community across the country. We're talking about working every year, year-round, to bring in all young people, especially those who are hardest to reach. Instead of being transactional, we believe this work should be developmental, focused on meeting each individual young person where they are to grow them into a knowledgeable, passionate participant in our democracy. These are by no means small changes, since this is a solution to a big systemic failing in our country. We think it's important that this is an effort that is focused on the community level, since young people's experience differ widely across communities, and communities know best how to interact with the young people who live there. I also believe that this effort of growing voters could be a way to strengthen communities themselves and an incredible way to build social capital within communities, but that is a topic for another day. But all of that is why I think it's so exciting to be talking to you all, because I think your community in Cape Cod or any other Massachusetts community that's represented on this call has an awesome opportunity to start digging into some of this work. It's going to take all of us to transform how we prepare young people for electoral participation. This next slide shows that there's a role for everyone in growing voters. I always say that you can't introduce me to someone who I can't find a role for in this work. So that includes the obvious stakeholders like election officials, campaigns, educators, and policymakers. But it also includes local youth groups that already reach teens, community organizations like libraries or museums that can integrate civic learning into their mission, philanthropists that fund more equitable voter engagement work, news media who can inform youth about voting and make elections relevant and exciting for young people, families that can model the importance of voting and civic engagement from a really early age, and of course, young people themselves who, as I think we're going to hear more about later in the program, already are doing a ton of this work and can lead when it comes to engaging their peers. I really encourage all of you to take a look at the report because it gives recommendations for each of these stakeholders for how you can grow voters in your community. But each of you working separately, doing your own thing isn't good enough. Next slide, please. At the heart of the Circle Growing Voters framework is the idea that what youth really need is an ecosystem of interconnected pathways to learn about and participate in elections. That is because young people have different levels of trust and access to each of these institutions, so it's critical to create multiple pathways to meet more young people where they are. We use the metaphor of a community garden because we believe growth happens when multiple stakeholders come together to give young people three essential elements. The first is access and exposure to civic learning and engagement opportunities. The second is support to take advantage of those opportunities. And the third is a culture that makes those opportunities meaningful and powerful. The exact combination of these elements and of institutions will depend on each young person, which is why we need each institution and each of you on this call and everyone in the community working together because we all have a role to play in this garden. And growth is only going to happen when we come together. Next slide, please. So obviously this is a pretty big undertaking and I hope I've made an effective case for it. If you're looking for ways to get started, I definitely encourage you to check out the report, which I will link to in the chat or maybe is already in the chat. And it has a ton of specific data and recommendations for different institutions and how they can come together across sectors to show up for young people in the Cape Cod community and beyond. And I will also put a link in the chat for the document that this slide is showing, which is our community mapping tool. It is an amazing place to start when thinking about growing voters. It's basically this worksheet where you can figure out where you are in your community ecosystem, what some of the assets in your community are when it comes to engaging young people, what might be some opportunities or gaps that exist right now, and how you can get started connecting with others to help grow voters in your community. That's all from me. Thank you all so much for listening and for having me. I'm always really excited to see so many people excited about young voters. And I hope that I was able to excite you a bit more with some new ideas for how to get more young people involved in our democracy. I know, especially as a young person who has had people in my life make me feel like I am not worthy of a voice in our democratic and political system, it is especially special to see so many people here who are excited to encourage young people to participate. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruby, very much. It's really helpful. What the League is all about, helping people work together as a community, and you've given us a really good roadmap for how to proceed with that. Thanks so much. I'd like to invite Mariana Crawley to unmute her phone. She is going to be joining us by phone. Mariana is a senior at Barnstable High School, and she'll talk to us a little bit about her feelings about the importance of voting. Mariana, can you unmute?
Hello.
There you are.
Hi. So, voting for me, as a person who has grown up in a democratic world, I have seen how important voting is. This is not only exemplified from me being a woman, but also a woman of color and being queer. Over the years, many of the rights of my minorities have been challenged, like of recently, the overturning of Roe versus Wade. This was a major wake-up call for my youth that voting is essential to upkeeping the rights that we have in order to maintain our rights that are being challenged by those less promising. We have to practice our rights as U.S. citizens and vote. And in Barnstable High School, I remember back in my sophomore year, they did a mock vote, and there were like 4 tables set up over in the main cafeteria where a lot of the students frequented for lunch. And there were dividers between each of the tables, sort of like you would do at an actual election. And there were questions that were actually based off of that year's midterms election. And it was sort of a way to prep students for the future and make them aware of what exactly was being questioned in that current time of politics. Personally, I enjoyed it myself, and I noticed that it sparked conversation among the students that I viewed as important discussions. For me, I view education as essential and a major support for young people, because without the knowledge of what exactly is being questioned in the government and being decided by our masses, we're sort of left blinded. Some students I've seen don't even see the importance of voting, like many of the adults in this world. So educating and showing examples of why it's important to vote is essential. During a lot of my history classes, along with like many of my other peers could probably go and back me up on this, but during my history classes, we would have like current news, and we would go and list what's going on in the current news. And whenever it was near like midterm elections or just elections in general, we would be talking about what was being questioned and what people were voting on, and we would voice our opinions and where exactly we would vote or where we would check off those boxes. So I think that maybe instilling that a bit more in school would be really, really helpful for the student population, since I know that a lot of my peers aren't educated in that, and some don't even know what exactly is going on in the government, or that certain things were being put into office, or like that certain people are being put into office. So I think that, yes, educating the student mass would be like very, very, very helpful in regards to why voting is important.
Thank you, Mariana. Good to hear your perspective. I'd like to welcome Ben Stoloff. Ben is a first-year law student in Chicago, a resident of Needham, and grandson of Florence and Ira Seldin. Ben, unmute, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you to Ruby for that really fascinating presentation. You know, even as a youth voter, I learned a lot about my peers, so that was great. As you heard, I'm Florence's grandson, and on behalf of myself, my family, I want to thank the League for putting on this event, all the panelists for participating, and everyone on this call for joining in. As you heard, I'm also a first-year law student at Northwestern in Chicago. I'm a member of a number of student organizations, including Street Law, where I teach lessons on relevant topics to Chicago high school students. I think engaging with youth about law and government is critical, and I'm excited to share a little bit about that with you today. And so voting is important to me because I really do believe it matters. While it is true that a single vote isn't likely to change the results of a statewide election, it simply isn't true at the local level. Boston City Council election recently was decided by just a single vote. So it can happen that your individual vote can really matter. And it's also the best way, I think, or one of the best ways to make sure your views are reflected in government. Politicians often will consider, their electoral prospects when they're making decisions. And in order to do that, they look at, how voters are going to react. And, if you're not voting, they're not going to think about how you're going to react when they're making their decisions. I also think it's especially important for young people because we have to live with the impact of the decisions elected officials make for a long time. While a single vote now may not seem important, over the long run, the stakes are really high. And no matter the issue, your vote really does matter. And so to prepare myself to vote, I first make sure I'm registered to vote. I just moved to Illinois and I registered here. And, I made sure to read up on what I needed to do to register to vote and, make sure I was eligible to vote. I sent in my application and, spent every couple of days checking the Secretary of State's website to make sure my registration went through. And I saw my name up there just a couple of days ago. So I'm happy that process worked out. And then, I also make sure that I look at the requirements. I think when, you're voting for the first time or voting in a new place, sometimes there are special rules about, bringing a license or not. And I think it's good to be cognizant of those when you're going to the polling place for the first time. I also, in determining who to vote for or, what to vote on a ballot measure, I find the League's voter guides very, very helpful. I think they do have great information on, both statewide issues and local candidates. I also think, local newspapers will have really good information and interviews with candidates that they, post online and usually make available for people to read. And then finally, speaking about what I think schools and larger community can do to support young adults, one of my first political memories was a mock vote in a presidential elementary school. Actually, I remember them having us all vote and reading off the elections over the loudspeaker when I was 7, so a long time ago. But that really stuck in my mind, and I think it's really important to start talking to people about voting and participation when they're young. And I think it doesn't only have to be about elections and politics. I think having classroom exercises that encourage people to speak up, that encourage participation are really, really important. Outside of schools, I think it's really important to talk about the issues that matter to young voters. I think there are many specific issues that youth voters care about in particular, and they're often, not the ones deciding what gets talked about. So I think, bringing the issues or bringing conversations to them about the things that matter to them is super important. And then here at Northwestern, we actually give, election day off. And I know not everyone can do that, obviously, but they help us connect as law students and future lawyers. They give us opportunities to participate, whether it's just phone banking in voter mobilization efforts or, actually going to a polling location and serving as a volunteer there. They give you opportunities to participate. And I think as schools should do a much better job of making people aware of the ways in which they can participate and how they're able to participate. In Massachusetts, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can now vote by mail, no excuse needed. And I think letting people know how easy it is for them to vote lowers the bar to entry. And I think a lot of people feel very busy and that they don't have time to vote, they don't want to go stand in line. And I think those feelings are valid. And I think we have ways to overcome them. And I think telling people about them is a huge step in getting them to participate. And so thank you again for having me. And this was super interesting.
Thanks, Ben. It's really great to hear your experience. It gives us a lot of ideas. Ellison, we'd like to welcome you. Ellison Carter is graduated from UMass Amherst in 2021 with a bachelor's degree in environmental science and in 2022 with a Master of Public Policy. She grew up in Barnstable and is interested in environmental and social justice. She has interned for State Representative Diggs, and she has recently joined the League of Women Voters of the Cape Cod area, where she co-chairs the Environmental Committee. Allison.
Thank you for that, Karen, and Ruby for the presentation, and everyone else for speaking. It's so great to see how many people came out tonight for this event. And for the past few years, and ever since I've been able to vote, and even before that, it's honestly, there's been times where it's felt hopeless and like we're taking 10 steps back for each step forward. And the most inspirational thing that's kind of changed this mentality for me is local government and what we're collectively capable of when we actually think about what we're doing at the local level. And there are such hubs for innovation and creativity and to implement solutions that utilize our local resources and our human capital, which you just don't see that at the federal level because that's where all the media and news really focuses on. But we truly have power when we look at our local government and local officials and we actually go out for those elections, because those are the ones that most people don't talk about. And that's something that we talked about greatly in all of my graduate classes, that we have the power to influence change, whether it's in our town, our county, which is definitely something unique to around here, the state, or even just in New England and beyond that in our region. Local government counts for something so much more than what people give it credit for. And that only happens when we vote. So it's definitely important. And that's something that I never understood that all through public school. And it was honestly not until a couple of years ago. And I think that this democracy in our government, we're stuck with this forever, for better and worse. And all of our lives are directly and indirectly impacted by the people who are representing us. And, you know, we may as well be proactive and select those people who have our best interests and our interests of our communities in mind. And when we see too often people reacting after, and, you know, if only people voted in those elections, we could have changed the outcomes. So really just engaging with people and friends and conversations, that's been huge into just understanding what our needs are and what really is important to people and how I can get my friends to vote and my family and, you know, all of that. And honestly, mail-in voting has been the greatest thing for me. When I was 18, the first time I walked into a poll, it felt like I walked into the SATs. My brain completely froze. I forgot everything. I was so prepared, never in any school. Like, I'm loving hearing about these mock votes. I never had that opportunity. And so I really panicked, and I'm pretty sure I did not vote for who I wanted to. The write-in, I did not know. So it's great because now, even though I like to do the research ahead of time and I like to know about the ballot questions and the candidates, you can't help it that happens in the moment, regardless of your age, and no matter if you're, you know, a seasoned pro at voting. So that's just really helpful to be able to do research on your own time and in that moment. And I think that also, like people I've mentioned, isn't as encouraged or talked about. And it's definitely a huge resource to people, and it's so easy and accessible. Thanks God for the internet nowadays. And I think this plays back into just education and awareness is something that, if you're not fortunate enough to take a civics class or, you know, a government class, not all schools offer it, or if you're not in that select group of students, you may never understand, like, what is voting? How do I do it? When do I do it? Or why should I even do it? And I think that this is a life skill that we just assume people know, but we shouldn't. Not everyone has the same home lives or friends or social circles where these things matter to them. And I think understanding that just because somebody isn't interested in politics does not mean their opinion shouldn't be heard or their voice shouldn't be heard. They just may have never had the opportunity to engage in these conversations. And I think treating people with, you know, this is a learning opportunity and helping them rather than, you know, like a condescending, oh, come on, because truly everyone's experience is so different in their education and their upbringing, and politics is something that just differs so greatly, that just speaking with people and, you know, being empathetic and leading with compassion and trying to help can really change the way people come out and vote. And I think it's so great seeing how active the league is with the youth. We had an event today at Cape Cod Academy, and Carol was there helping people vote. We had 140 young students, and it was incredible because many of them never would have had that opportunity at their schools. So continuing to do what you're all doing and just facilitating those dialogues and respecting the youth, because sometimes, like Ruby had said, it doesn't feel like our opinion is always appreciated, but we're definitely here for the long haul, and we would love to see positive change for whatever that means to each of our opinions. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Allison, and we are delighted to have you join us in the league. We are going to benefit from your energy and enthusiasm a great deal. I'd like to welcome Talis D'Souza. Talis was nominated by Asher Hamilton, who is on the program list, and Asher felt it would be better to have a student represent Cape Cod Community College. Although I do see Asher here, and after Talis speaks, if you'd like to say something, Asher, I will invite you to say something as well. Talis is from Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. He is 24 years old and has lived in the United States for 6 years. He's currently enrolled with the criminal justice program at Cape Cod Community College. He's very passionate about helping people and changing the world around him for better. Talis is on a pathway to become a U.S. citizen and offers us the perspective of someone who does not yet have the right to vote in the United States, but believes in how important that right is. Talis, welcome. You can go ahead and unmute.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you so much. I'm very pleased to be here. And I'm very amazed how every one of you guys are so smart, and how the opportunity I'm having right now, it's so important to me. So why voting in the United States for young people like me would be so important? I feel like sometimes we don't realize, and Americans, they don't realize, and I don't think Americans should take for granted and how much it's important, because voting, it's not just putting someone in power, but it's actually allowing that person to change a future, and eventually gonna not change only your future, but your kids, your grandkids, your future in the next 4 or maybe 20 years. And we sometimes I see many people talking about voting, talking about parties and stuff, and I see that they love to talk about who's in power, but they forget to think about the future, because we're not putting someone in power. We're actually telling them, listen, that's the way I believe your vision, and that's how I believe in my future gonna be. And I really love the way Americans think about voting, and it's so sad to see that many Americans still, they don't vote. And because that's one thing about Brazil, we do vote. We have to. And just so you guys know, on Sunday, this next Sunday, we are going to vote. So we're going to have election in Brazil for a new president. And I see in the social media how people are actually willing to vote, willing to make progress. And we have so much problems in the United States, either immigration, healthcare. Now we're having problems with housings. We're having so many things. And I do realize that from now on, many young people, they're actually going, to stand up and be like, wait, I'm gonna vote. And I would say that America's elections, either senators or presidential elections, not just make a huge impact in America, but also in the world. Makes a difference in everywhere, either in Brazil, Latin America, or either in Asia, or either in Central America. It changes everything, because the United States has so much power over the nations. And how lucky and how blessed Americans are, because you guys have the power to not just change your country, but also change everyone's lives. That's what I realized in the last years I have been living here. I got in the United States in 2016, right when election was happening. And I realized how people that come to this country for opportunities, immigrants, people like me, we start thinking about it, and we're like, wait, election is actually important because impact us, and how Americans, they have so much power. If I vote if one American young person vote right now, it's not voting to change his future or to change, his country, but it's also voting to change China, to change Spain, to change other countries, because America has so much power. And I really thank for the opportunity of sharing my view. And I do believe Americans should not take it for granted. I think Americans should go and vote. Young people, you have so much power, you have so much voice, and Americans have so much people out there. We look up to you guys. We look to you and we be like, wow, Americans actually are doing great. Everything Americans do, people outside, in the nations, we want to do. We impact us, anything, any law. And I really want to thank you all for giving me the opportunity of sharing my view. And I do think voting is important, not because it's changing the United States, but it's changing the nations. The nations are, we are, people out there are actually waiting for you guys to vote. So we can have hope, or we can even be more sad or even more terrified about our future. That's what happens when elections happens in America. Thank you, guys.
Thank you so much. It was really important to hear your perspective. Asher, did you want to say one or two sentences to sort of summarize or to say something for Cape Cod community?
Oh my gosh, Cape Cod Community College in the house. Thank you very much for really sharing your experiences, Thales. You are amazing. And when you start talking about the intellectual pursuit that's happening right here, back and forth, you are part of this. And I think that's a big part of when we start talking about the structural things that happen in this country, that certain people are considered included in the fabric of the nation and other people just are not. Something that really resonated with me was what Bennett said. He was being very honest. He was exposed to voter education and civic experience at a very early age. Not everybody, especially a person of color, communities of color, have that beautiful experience. So when we think about something that I keep hearing, hope, 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 keep hope alive. It's one of the reasons why Obama, the first African-American president of the United States of the America, because there was this thought that hope could bring us back to a place of wholesomeness, a place where everybody's included in the fabric of this country. We are honest about, if we are honest about this, we know that that's not always so. So looking at voting as an inspirational way of connecting, I think there's got to be a little something greater that we should be talking about. How do we connect the dots a little closer? Because if your experience at the age of 7 wasn't, I'm sorry, but civic experience and all these other things that make you an educated citizen, if that wasn't your experience, how do we better connect folks to knowing that voting is important? Something I'll leave with. SGA, Student Government Association. In our last election, we had only 47 students that voted for their representatives, okay? 47 students who decided, hey, I think this might be the person who we want to elect to represent us. So I thought that this was horrible. How could something be so horrible that happens to our institution? What about the virtual online learning experience? Why aren't students doing this? What I found out from other colleges, we have 15 community colleges across the state of Massachusetts. The average, 5% of students that are voting across the state for their own very specific, narrow student government. So those are the students who are going into the electronic polls and saying, hey, I'm pulling the lever. Here's who I'd like to have represent me. By the way, Thales, I hope you do run for president of the student government here at the college.
Thanks.
But I will leave with this. It's something that we need to think about. Why aren't our students of color and our citizens of color really engaged?
Good questions for us to pursue. Thanks very much. I'd like to turn to Rosemary Shields. Rosemary is the co-director of our voter service program here in the Cape Cod Area League, and Rosemary has some resources to share with us about voting.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody. It's been a really inspiring talk. And but what I want to say is we all need help in voting. I moved from out of state to Cape Cod in 2016, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I had heard of the League of Women Voters, and I joined. and I was led by the hand on what I needed to do. And it took me 2 years to figure this all out. And then what I discovered is the 2 years that it took me to figure out how to vote and where to vote, et cetera, is all in one place. And could I have my first slide? And could I have my first slide? Thank you. Anybody who needs to know anything about voting needs to get on to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website. And it's very easy. You just write SEC STATE sec.state.ma.us, and you get here. And this is the Secretary of State's website, and you'll see the upper left red icon is the elections and voting. And so you would click that on, and when you click that on, the next slide shows you everything that you need to know about voting. It tells you how to register. It lets you know, am I registered? It shows you how to vote by mail. Where do I vote? So you can go to your poll places. You can track your ballot. Once you send your by mail, you send your ballot in by mail, you can track your ballot to make sure it got in and it got counted. And then you can find your election office and drop boxes, or you can put your mail in the mail. And it tells you upcoming elections and gives you all the resources for early voting. And you can just go on this website and find all of this. And it makes you, it took me 2 years to become quote unquote an expert. All you have to do is get on this and you become an expert in voting in Massachusetts. Next slide. Your next best friend is going to your town clerk's office. And I just sort of listed Bourne and Barnstable and Brewster and Chatham and Dennis. If you have any questions about voting, how do I vote, register, you can go to the Secretary of State. Or I cannot tell you, I have probably talked to every town clerk on Cape Cod, and they've all been so helpful. But another thing that you can get is a sample ballot. And that to me is so important. If we could put up the next slide, you can go and get a sample ballot and you can see who is running, governor, lieutenant governor, attorney general, secretary of state is running this year, treasurer, auditor, representative in Congress, the governor's council who decide on judges, senator, state rep, district attorney, sheriff, county commissioner, and the Barnstable, the Assembly of Delegates. And then the next part of the state is are the election questions, and how you can find out what are the ballot questions. I really loved hearing what Allison said. You walk into a polling place and suddenly it feels like with the dividers and the tables that you're taking your SATs. And if you can get a sample ballot and look at what all the things on the ballot, all the people who are running, because really another problem we have is people don't vote for everybody. If you get a sample ballot, you can look up the candidates, you can look up the ballot questions, and therefore you can feel comfortable. And then, go online, go to the candidates' websites, various places. This is showing there are 4 questions on the ballot. First question is quote unquote the millionaire's tax, but taxes for education and roads. The second one is for dental insurance, how much dental insurance should be given to the patients. The third one that I'm still trying to wrestle with is about liquor licenses. Should we have more? Should we not have as many and try to reform the system better? And then the fourth one, which is also something that the League of Women Voters supports, it's safer roads. It is giving driver's licenses to immigrants. So that's a yes vote for us. But, but you need to go and read these questions and decide, for yourself. So I just want you to know that we all need mentors. I needed a mentor when I came here, and the league was my best friend. But you need mentors like your favorite teacher, or the activists, the peers, the people that you admire in your school. There are Greta Thunbergs in every high school, or every school, college. And you just need to sort of connect with the people that you see that are being activated. And I really liked what Ruby had to say about a vote is very important, but it punctuates what you've already done, which is you've protested, or you have gone and done community service, or you've done community organizing, and that's what you need to do. Finally, am I out of time?
Could you wrap up in just
one other thing? You can take down my samples now. And then there's something called a newspaper. I worked for the New York Times for 23 years, so I love newspapers. But I know that this is an old-fashioned thing to be looking at. But there's so many resources online where you can get dependable information, and I recommend local newspapers. Of course, I would recommend the New York Times, but anything that you can get online where you can get information, because finding the information is very important. Thank you. I didn't mean to take so much time.
Not at all, Rosemary. Thank you. It was all really very helpful. I'd like to introduce Eileen Elias. Eileen is going to monitor the chat for us and let us know if anyone has any questions. If anybody else has questions, please add them in the chat right now. Eileen.
Hi. Good evening, everybody. At this time, please enter questions into the chat. There are no questions, but there were some questions that came up as the presenters were speaking. One has to do, at least indirectly, when we talk about media. And I would really like to hear from one of the students about how to use social media to communicate what you just heard from Rosemary in regards to what she called her cheat sheet. If somebody could answer it, and then after that, I have a key question that's in the chat.
And also, I want to alert you to the fact that there are questions in the question and answer part, not only in the chat.
Thank you. But it's just how do you, like, somebody could take a minute, one of the students, Mariana or Ben, perhaps one of you could just start off. Ben?
Sure. Yeah, I can start. So I think, with social media, I see people post all the time, just like pictures of their I voted stickers. And I think that's all you have to do. I don't think you need to preach to people. I think you just need to show people that you're participating. I think that makes people more likely to participate when they see others doing it. And I think just sharing that, you're involved, you're trying to participate is enough to at least start people to thinking about whether or not they want to participate.
Thank you. Do any of the other students, presenters want to add to what Ben just said?
One thing I would add, as someone who's a student
Thank you, Ruby,
is that for me, at least, whenever I think about how I'm posting about elections, the main time I try to share things is when a deadline is coming up. So for voter registration deadlines, I think it's really easy for people to miss that. And so I always will share, pretty much every time there's a voter registration deadline, I'll share that on some social media platform. And I think the other thing I would say is that there's a lot of different kinds of social media, and some of the best ways to interact with your peers when it comes to voting is just to text your 5 closest friends and make sure they've updated their voter registrations. I know 3 of my friends just moved, so I made sure that I texted them all and was like, hey, did you change your voter registration? Here's one local election that's going to be really exciting in your city this year. And then they're always like, thank you for the reminder, you're the best. And
great.
I think everyone always really appreciates it. So
great example, and I'm glad you individualized it. Thank you, Ruby. There is a question that is as follows. Question for Allison, to start at least. My 4 grandkids range in age from 21 to 26. Half of them are now working full-time. They are so disillusioned over what has happened recently in our country politically. They feel that they have no power. They feel they have voted, and yet things still get more and more screwed up, and that we're going backwards, not forwards. How do you convince your friends to still keep pushing forward when it seems to them to not make a difference to them? They care, they work hard, and they are disillusioned. So, Allison, this is first directed to you.
Yeah, so I have a good example of something that made me think about this when I was reading it. This spring, after everything going on between Ukraine and women's rights, and we had a lot of situations going on within UMass, everyone was just really upset. And honestly, the mood was very depressing, and it was a public policy analysis class. And then our teacher pulled up some data on metrics relating to greenhouse gas emissions. And he said, listen, I know everything feels horrible right now, and you want to think the worst of everything, but for some of these things, we're actually ahead. Like globally, we're actually ahead, and we're on track to meet these goals. And none of us actually anticipated that. When he showed us the data, we're like, okay, well, we can't refute that. The numbers are right there. And I think it just showed that we rarely take the time to celebrate these small victories, and we focus consistently on, well, we should be doing this. We need to be doing this. It's not enough. And environmental science student, I agree, it's not enough. We have climate change and all these things that we're seeing, but there's so much hard work, commitment, and innovation that has led us to these small victories that then make us feel better going in, like taking on the next issue and the next, just everything. And, we need to focus on the journey rather than the end goal and the end election and everything that's happening along the way, because otherwise it's impossible to stay sane and grounded. And kind of just a rule of thumb in my family is like everyone's right there, if you don't vote, you're part of the problem and you can't complain. So when I hear my siblings or friends complaining about things and posting, but they didn't vote, it's very hypocritical. And so, it will feel hopeless at times, but it's just important to keep going and keep putting in the time and effort and having these conversations and actually showing up to vote.
Thank you for that, Allison. It gives us hope. I regret to say that we have run out of time for more questions. I would at this time like to welcome Judy Seldin, Florence's daughter, for some closing comments.
First of all, I want to thank all the panelists for your wisdom and thoughts in this very first speaker series that serves to educate others and also to honor my mother, Florence Seldin. It's really heartening to hear from young people. I'm reminded that they hold the keys to the future. And thank you to the League of Women Voters of Cape Cod area for organizing this particular speaking event, as well as future ones still to come. I know the League would love to continue this discussion with area schools and colleges. The League is such an important resource in our communities. You can find their contact information, local leagues on their website, certainly. And I hope participants here tonight will reach out for more information to their League. As noted earlier, my mother was a proud League member for over 50 years because she believed fervently in the power of the individual vote and the value of democracy. She was a role model to our family, but also to many others because of her vigorous activism. So I encourage everyone here and those hopefully that will hear this recording to use your voice because your vote does matter. And we saw some of that data thanks to Ruby. Young or older, walk into that voting booth or mail in that ballot, because democracy, we know, is not guaranteed, and it surely is not a spectator sport. So thanks again to all of the panelists, to the League of Women Voters of Cape Cod area, and to everyone that spent your time with us this evening. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Good evening.